The year was 1887, and winter had already settled its cold fingers over St. Louis. Snow clung to the edges of rooftops like lace, and smoke from chimneys drifted into the gray morning air. In a small boarding house on the edge of town, Clara Winslow sat by the window, her fingers trembling as she dipped her pen into an inkwell. The sheet of paper before her was clean, untouched, the way she wished her own life could be. She had read the advertisement a dozen times. Rancher widower seeks wife. Must be of steady character and kind disposition. Age and appearance of no consequence. Write to Eli Turner, Silver Creek Ranch, Montana Territory. For days she'd stared at that small notice printed among the classifieds between horses for sale and boarding for ladies. Most women would have dismissed it, perhaps even laughed at the thought of marrying a stranger. But Clara was not most women. She had no family left, no home to return to, and no future to build where she was. What she did have were the scars, angry, twisted reminders of a fire that had changed her life 2 years ago. Once, she'd been a milliner's apprentice, known for her delicate hands and quiet smile. But that night, the night the lamp was thrown, the night her husband's rage turned deadly, had burned more than her skin. She still woke gasping, remembering the smell of smoke, the crackle of her dress catching fire, and the sound of his laughter as he left her to die. The doctor said she was lucky to live. Clara had never felt lucky since now, each time she passed a mirror. She saw a stranger staring back, the right side of her face smooth and pale, the left marred by the thick, uneven ridges of scar tissue that crept down her cheek and neck. The world had no place for scarred women. Employers turned her away, landladies whispered, and children pointed dots, so she lived quietly, mending clothes for coins and keeping her head down. Until that ad. Now, with pen in hand, she took a deep breath and began to write. Mr. Turner, I read your notice and hope you won't mind hearing from me. My name is Clara Winslow. I am 25 years old and of good health. I can cook, sew, and keep a home. I am not what most men would call pretty, for I carry scars from an accident. I do not seek pity, only a place where I might be of use and treated kindly. I cannot promise beauty, but I can promise honesty, hard work, and a willing heart. Her hand paused. Should she tell him more? Would honesty ruin her chance? She imagined him, a tall, lonely rancher in some far-off valley, waiting for a letter from a stranger. Would he flinch at the thought of her face? Or would he see what no one else had, that she was still a woman capable of love, laughter, and faith? She decided he deserved the truth. If you choose to write me back, know that I come not out of vanity, but out of hope, that there is still a place for broken things to be mended. When the letter was sealed, she sat staring at it, heart hammering. Outside, the church bells rang the hour. She pressed the envelope to her lips, whispered a prayer, not for love, but for peace, and dropped it into the postman's bag. As the door closed behind him, she felt something shift. For the first time in years, she had reached toward the world instead of hiding from it. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that far away, in the wide Montana wilderness, a man named Eli Turner would soon open her letter and see not desperation, but courage written between every line. Far across the snow-dusted plains of Montana Territory, the sun struggled to rise over the Silver Creek Ranch. A frost-bitten wind swept through the valley, bending the tall grass and rattling the barn doors. Inside the big house that overlooked the endless fields, Eli Turner sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold. He wasn't a man given to lingering, but mornings like this, silent, gray, and lonely, made him think too much. The ranch had once been full of life. Laughter had spilled from the kitchen. Bread had baked in the oven. Music from his late wife Annie's fiddle had drifted through the open windows on summer nights. Now there was only the creak of the old porch and the moan of wind through the rafters. Eli had grown used to it, or told himself he had. 3 years had passed since the fever took Annie and their unborn child within days of each other. The doctor had ridden out too late, and the little wooden cross he'd carved for their grave still stood on the hill overlooking the creek dot since then. Eli had thrown himself into work, branding cattle, mending fences, breaking horses. The men who worked for him respected his quiet strength, but knew better than to ask questions. He spoke little, laughed less, and never set foot in the small room that had once held Annie's sewing table and the cradle. He'd built by hand. It was the ranch foreman, old Sam Jenkins, who had suggested he take out a newspaper advertisement. "You can't run this place and fight off the silence forever, boss," Sam had said one evening by the fire. "A man needs company, even if it's just someone to keep the dust off the parlor." Eli had given a short, humorless laugh. "You suggesting I go wife hunting through the mail?" "Why not?" "Better than finding one in the saloon," Sam had retorted, puffing on his pipe. The next week, the ad was printed in the St. Louis Gazette. Eli hadn't thought much would come of it. A few letters had trickled in, some from women too young, others too desperate or too polished, writing as if auditioning for a fairy tale. He'd read them without feeling, then tuck them away until the day he opened the one that began, "Mr. Turner, I read your notice and hope you won't mind hearing from me." Her handwriting was steady, neat, and there was something in the tone, simple, without pretense. No flowery promises, no false modesty. Just honesty. She had told him of her scars, her work, and her hope to be of use. Most men might have turned the page aside at that admission. But Eli read it again and again, his rough thumb tracing the ink where she had written, "I do not seek pity, only a place where I might be of use and treated kindly." He sat back, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. There was a kind of courage there, the kind he hadn't seen in years, the kind Annie used to have when she faced down the hardships of the frontier with a grin. Eli rose and walked to the window. Outside, the land stretched wide and empty, snow gleaming like silver under the morning light. He imagined a woman arriving by train, her life folded up in a single valise, stepping down into this wilderness without knowing what awaited her. What kind of woman did that? One who had nothing to lose, or one who had survived something terrible? That night, after pacing the house until the fire burned low, Eli finally sat again at the kitchen table. He took up his pen, stiff with disuse, and began to write his reply. "Mrs. Winslow, I was moved by your letter. I am not a man of many words, nor am I looking for a fairy tale. But I believe in honest work and quiet understanding. If you are willing to make the journey, you will find a home here, not judgment. The land is harsh, but it gives back what you tend to it. I hope in time we both might find some peace in that." When he signed his name and sealed the envelope, Eli felt the strangest thing. A flicker of warmth he hadn't known since before grief made his heart a closed door. He didn't call it hope yet, but it was close enough. The westbound train let out a long, mournful whistle as it pulled away from the St. Louis station, its iron wheels grinding against the rails. Clara Winslow sat in the third car, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, the rhythmic clatter of the train echoing like a heartbeat beneath her ribs. She had never been farther west than Kansas City. Now she was headed into the unknown, to Montana Territory, to a ranch owned by a man she knew only through letters, to a life she prayed might finally let her breathe again. The journey stretched before her like a test of faith. The air inside the passenger car was thick with coal smoke and the scent of too many bodies packed too close. Mothers hushed crying babies, a traveling salesman bragged about his wares, and 2 cowhands snored in the corner. Yet Clara sat apart, by the window, her thoughts miles away. Every time she glanced at her reflection in the glass, she saw the faint outline of her scars, the uneven skin running down her left cheek and neck. Half hidden beneath her bonnet dot when the conductor came by to punch tickets. He gave her a polite nod but avoided meeting her eyes for long. She was used to that. People rarely looked at her directly anymore. The first few days after the fire, she'd hidden from every mirror, unable to face what had been done to her. But time had taught her something painful and true. The world would never stop staring. So she might as well lift her chin and meet its gaze. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass, watching the flat plains roll by, brown, endless, and free. Somewhere beyond those distant hills was Eli Turner, the man who had answered her letter with quiet, steady words that had felt more like a promise than a proposal. He hadn't asked for a photograph, hadn't flinched from her confession about the scars. His letter had been brief, but kind. The land is harsh, but it gives back what you tend to it. If you are willing to make the journey, you will find a home here, not judgment. Those words had been her lifeline for weeks. She had folded and unfolded that letter until the paper grew soft at the edges. She didn't know what kind of man Eli was, whether he was gentle or stern, tall or weathered by sun, but she knew he was decent. And that was more than she had dared hope for in years. At each stop, she caught glimpses of other lives, laughing families, young couples. Men in dusters waiting for wives who would step off the train radiant and unblemished. When she thought of stepping down at her own destination, her stomach clenched. Would Eli's eyes widen when he saw her? Would pity shadow his face? Or worse, would disappointment? When night fell, she sat in the dim glow of the train's lanterns, pulling her small satchel closer. Inside was all she owned: a worn Bible, a hairbrush missing half its bristles, and a patchwork shawl that had belonged to her mother. She traced her fingers over the cover of the Bible, whispering a verse she had memorized long ago: "He healeth the broken in heart, and bindeth up their wounds." The words steadied her breathing. As the train rumbled farther west, the land began to rise, hills giving way to distant snow-capped peaks. The sight made her breath catch. It was wild and untamed, beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. For the first time in years, she felt something close to awe instead of fear. The next morning, she awoke to pale light spilling through the windows and the conductor's shout, "Silver Creek Station, next stop." Clara's heart hammered. She reached up, straightened her bonnet, and smoothed her dress. Her palms were damp, but she didn't falter. As the train slowed and the whistle blew one final time, she whispered to herself, "You are more than what was done to you." When the train doors opened and she stepped down onto the cold, dusty platform, she wasn't just leaving St. Louis behind. She was leaving her old life buried in its ashes. Ahead of her, the wind carried the scent of pine and earth. And somewhere in that vast waiting land stood the man who might just be her redemption. The train hissed and groaned as it came to a stop at Silver Creek Station. A lonely platform framed by snow-tipped pines and a sky so wide it seemed to swallow the world. The chill in the air was sharp enough to sting Clara Winslow's cheeks as she stepped down, her gloved hand gripping the metal rail for balance. The small wooden station was nothing like the bustling depots back east, just a bench, a water tower, and a freight cart half buried in snow. She clutched her satchel tightly, her breath rising in white clouds. The platform was nearly empty save for a few townsfolk greeting arrivals and a ranch hand loading supplies. And then, standing apart from them all, was a man in a weathered brown coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His boots dusted with snow. Eli Turner. He was taller than she'd imagined from his letters. Broad-shouldered, the kind of man shaped by years of hard work and wind. His face bore the sun's marks, faint lines at the corners of his eyes, a light beard along his jaw, and yet there was something still, almost gentle, about his presence. He watched her carefully, hat in hand, as though afraid to move too fast. Clara's throat tightened. She had faced crueler stares before, but this was different. She feared the moment his expression would shift, the flicker of pity or worse, revulsion. Beneath her bonnet, she felt the old scars tugging against her skin. She wished she could hide them, wished she could turn back time to the day before the fire. But there was no undoing what had been done, Mrs. Winslow. His voice was deep calm, a man used to speaking to horses and wide, open land more than people. She nodded. Yes, sir. He took a step forward, eyes steady on hers. Eli Turner. She braced herself, waiting for the glance, that inevitable quick flick toward her scarred cheek, and yes, she saw it. But it wasn't disgust that passed through his face. It was something quieter. Recognition, maybe, understanding, as though he, too, carried something that couldn't be seen at first glance. I hope the journey wasn't too hard on you, he said. Offering his arm for a heartbeat, she hesitated. She hadn't taken a man's arm in years. But there was no judgment in his tone, no expectation. Just a simple kindness. She placed her hand lightly on his sleeve, and he guided her down the last step onto the snowy ground. I've got the wagon waiting, he said, gesturing toward the road. It's a fair drive to the ranch. You'll be wanting a hot meal when we get there. She smiled faintly. That sounds lovely. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but he heard Dot as they walked toward the wagon. Clara noticed how careful he was, matching her pace, never rushing. The horses stamped and snorted, breath rising like steam in the cold. Eli loaded her small trunk onto the back with ease. Not much baggage, he remarked gently, climbing up to the driver's seat. I left most of my life behind, she said before she could stop herself. Her cheeks warmed, partly from the cold, partly from the truth of it. He looked at her then. Really looked, not at her scars, but at the woman sitting beside him. Her hands folded in her lap like she was holding the pieces of herself together. Sometimes, he said softly, that's the only way to start over. The wagon creaked forward, wheels crunching through the snow. Clara turned to watch the train disappear in the distance, smoke trailing into the sky like the last breath of her old life. Ahead stretched a dirt road winding through miles of open land, mountains hazy in the distance. Eli kept his eyes on the trail, hands steady on the reins. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that carried weight. Like the earth before rain, Clara drew her shawl tighter and whispered a quiet thank you. Though she wasn't sure if she meant it for the man beside her, for the life ahead, or for the courage that had finally brought her here. For the first time in years, she wasn't running from something. She was being carried toward something new, and maybe, just maybe, toward home. The wagon rattled through the frozen fields until the road turned and the Silver Creek Ranch came into view. The main house stood at the base of a low hill, its wooden walls weathered to a soft gray by years of wind and sun. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and beyond it stretched acres upon acres of open pasture. Horses grazed near the fence line. Cattle dotted the hills in the distance. To Clara Winslow, it looked like another world, vast, lonely, and achingly beautiful. As the wagon stopped in front of the house, Eli Turner climbed down and offered her a hand. She hesitated, then took it, her small gloved fingers trembling slightly in his rough, calloused palm. The contact was brief but grounding. She followed him up the steps to the porch, her eyes sweeping over everything, the old rocking chair, the neat stack of chopped wood, the horseshoe nailed above the door for luck. Inside. Warmth met her immediately, the scent of pine, smoke, and bread baking somewhere nearby. The home was plain but clean, every corner speaking of care and quiet order. A fire blazed in the stone hearth, casting a golden glow over the wooden floors. I've kept the place tidy, Eli said, removing his hat, but it could use a woman's touch. Clara set her satchel down near the door and looked around. her heart caught between gratitude and nervousness. "It's lovely," she murmured. And she meant it, not because it was grand, but because it felt safe. He led her through the small parlor to a narrow staircase. "Your room's up here," he said. "I thought you might want some time to settle before supper. I'll see to the horses." Clara followed him up the steps and into a modest room with a small bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the snowy fields. There were fresh linens folded at the foot of the bed and a vase of wildflowers on the knit stand, wilted now, but clearly placed with care. She turned toward him, surprised. "You did this for me?" she asked softly. Eli shrugged, looking suddenly shy. Didn't know what else a lady might like. A faint smile touched her lips. "It's perfect." "Thank you." He nodded once, then stepped back toward the door. "Supper's at 6. Take your time, Mrs. Winslow." When the door closed, Clara stood in the stillness, letting her eyes roam the room again. The floorboards creaked faintly beneath her feet. She set her satchel on the bed and drew out her few belongings, the Bible, the brush, the shawl. Her hands lingered on the shawl, its familiar fabric comforting. She draped it over the chair, then moved to the window. Outside, L.A. was walking toward the barn, shoulders squared against the cold. The sight stirred something deep within her, admiration perhaps, or gratitude that such a man had opened his home to her without question. Yet under that warmth lay unease. It had been years since she'd lived under a man's roof. The last time, love had turned to terror overnight. Her fingers brushed the scar on her cheek. The skin tightened, a reminder that not all wounds healed. He seems kind, she told herself. But kindness can fade. At supper, they ate in near silence. Eli spoke of the ranch, the coming spring, the calving season, the price of feed. His voice was steady, practical, safe. Clara listened, grateful for his gentleness but too unsure to share much in return. When their hands brushed as she passed him the bread, she flinched without meaning to. He noticed, paused, then continued as though nothing had happened. Afterward, she helped clear the table. "You don't have to," he began. "I'd like to," she interrupted quickly. Needing to feel useful, to earn her place. When everything was done, he lit a lantern and showed her where to bolt the front door from the inside. "You'll sleep better knowing it's locked," he said quietly. "Thank you." Her voice wavered, because that small gesture, the right to lock a door, was something she hadn't had in years. That night, lying beneath the quilt, Clara listened to the wind against the windows and the distant sounds of the ranch settling into sleep. For the first time since the fire, she didn't feel trapped. She wasn't healed. Not yet, but she was safe, and safety, she realized, was the first fragile step toward hope. Winter melted slowly into spring at Silver Creek Ranch. And with each passing week, Clara Winslow Turner found herself learning the rhythms of her new home. She rose before dawn, lit the stove, and brewed coffee before Eli came in from the barns. The once silent house began to hum again. The smell of baking bread, the sound of water boiling, the soft creak of floorboards under gentle footsteps. She mended shirts for Eli and the ranch hands, tended to the hens, and slowly grew accustomed to the vast quiet that stretched between the mountains. There were still moments when fear brushed against her, when the doors slammed in the wind, or Eli's boots sounded too suddenly behind her. But he never raised his voice, never reached for her without asking. He was patient, steady as the land he worked, and that steadiness was becoming her comfort. One afternoon, as she hung linens in the yard, Eli approached with his sleeves rolled up, sun glinting on his hair. "Town day tomorrow," he said. "Need anything?" Clara thought for a moment. "Thread. And maybe flour, if you can manage. I'll take the wagon in before noon. You could come along if you'd like." The suggestion made her pulse quicken. She hadn't been to town since her arrival, too afraid of curious stares and whispered questions. "I think I'll stay," she said quietly. He nodded, not pressing her. "Suit yourself." But the faint disappointment in his tone stayed with her long after he left. The next morning dawned bright and deceptively calm. Eli rode into town with a wagon full of eggs and cured meat to trade. Clara spent the day cleaning, humming softly as she worked. The house felt almost like it belonged to her now, the hearth warm, the table polished, the scent of soap lingering in the air. She was sweeping the porch when she saw a horse in the distance, a dark bay, its rider hunched against the wind. At first, she thought it must be one of Eli's ranch hands returning early. But as the figure drew closer, something in her chest went cold. The gait of that horse, the tilt of the man's hat, it was all too familiar. When the rider dismounted and called her name. Her broom slipped from her fingers. "Clara." The voice was smooth, venom wrapped in velvet. "You're a hard woman to find." It was Joseph Hawley, the man she had once called husband, the man who had scarred her and left her for dead. His smile was the same cruel twist she remembered. "You didn't think you could run forever, did you?" She stumbled backward, heart thundering. "You have no right to be here." "I have every right," he sneered, stepping closer. "You're my wife." "I'm not," she whispered, voice trembling. "You forfeited that when you tried to kill me." He laughed low and cold. "You think some rancher can save you? You think you can hide behind a new name and forget what you are?" Clara backed toward the door, fumbling for the latch, but before she could close it, the thunder of hooves broke through the tense air. Eli appeared, coat flapping, his face carved with fury. "Get away from her," he said, voice flat and dangerous. Joseph turned, eyes narrowing. "And you must be the new man." "I was just reclaiming what's mine." Eli's hand rested on the butt of his revolver. "She's not yours." "Not anymore." The two men locked eyes, silence thick as storm clouds. Then Joseph spat in the dirt. "You'll regret this," he hissed, mounting his horse. "She ruined you too, just like she ruined me." He yanked the reins and galloped off, dust rising behind him. When he was gone, Clara sank to her knees on the porch, shaking. Eli was beside her in an instant, his hands steady on her shoulders. "You're safe," he said firmly. "He won't touch you." "Not while I'm breathing." Tears blurred her vision. "You don't understand. He'll come back. He always comes back." Eli lifted her chin gently, meeting her eyes. "Then let him come. This time, he'll find you're not alone." The wind rustled the pines, carrying away the last of Joseph Hale's laughter, but not the chill it left behind. Clara knew her past had found her again. Yet for the first time, she wasn't running. She had someone willing to stand beside her, and that made all the difference. The days after Joseph Hale's arrival were heavy with fear. Clara Turner woke often in the night, heart pounding at every sound, the creak of the barn door, the cry of a coyote, the whisper of wind across the porch. Each time, Eli would rise quietly, check the windows, and reassure her, "It's just the wind, Clara. He's gone." But they both knew better. Men like Joseph Hawley didn't disappear so easily. 2 days later, word reached them through Sam Jenkins, the ranch foreman, that Hawley was in town, bragging at the saloon, telling anyone who'd listen that his runaway wife had been stolen by a rancher. By morning, whispers had spread through Silver Creek. People stared openly when Eli rode in for supplies. Some nodded with sympathy, others with judgment. "Best keep your head high, son," the storekeeper muttered, bagging Eli's flour. "Ain't right, what folks are saying, but gossip travels faster than truth." Eli clenched his jaw and thanked him, then returned to the ranch determined. When he walked through the door that evening, Clara was sitting by the fire, her sewing forgotten in her lap. She looked up, saw his expression, and knew. "He's telling lies, isn't he?" She whispered. "He's telling stories," Eli replied carefully. "But that's all they are. The truth will hold." Clara's throat tightened. "Truth never helped me before. Men like Joseph, they twist it. They make people believe what they want." Eli knelt beside her. "Then we'll face him together. You've got nothing to be ashamed of." But Clara wasn't so sure. The next morning, Sheriff Harlan rode out to the ranch. He was a broad-shouldered man with a kind face, but his tone was formal. "Mrs. Turner," he said, "there's been a complaint filed. Says you left a lawful marriage without cause." Eli stepped forward. "She left to save her life. That man nearly killed her." The sheriff nodded. "I believe it. But the law needs her word. If she's willing to speak it before witnesses, we can settle this once and for all." Clara's breath hitched. Testify before the whole town? The thought turned her stomach. But then she saw Eli's face, calm, steady, protective. And she remembered the years she'd spent silent, letting fear rule her. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. "I'll speak," she said softly. The hearing was held in the small courthouse 2 days later. Half the town turned up, curious or cruel. It was hard to tell. Joseph Hawley sat near the front, smug and confident, his slick hair combed back, his smirk daring her to open her mouth. When Clara stepped to the front, her knees felt weak. The sheriff motioned for her to speak. Double quotes, "Mrs. Turner," he said. "Tell us in your own words what happened." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. But then she saw Eli, standing at the back of the room, arms crossed, eyes steady on her. That gave her strength. "I married Joseph Hawley when I was 19, she began, voice trembling. "I thought he was kind. I was wrong." She told them of the anger, the blows, the night he threw the lamp that set their home aflame. The gasps that rippled through the room didn't matter. She kept going, the words spilling out, years of silence broken open. When she finished, Joseph's smirk had vanished. "She's lying," he shouted, but the sheriff cut him off. "I've heard enough. You've got no claim here, Hawley. The law won't protect a man who tries to kill his wife." The decision was clear. Hawley was ordered out of Silver Creek by sundown. As the crowd dispersed, Clara stood frozen, trembling, not from fear this time, but from release. Eli came to her side and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her scars. "You did it," he said quietly. "You faced him." Tears filled her eyes. "I was so afraid." He smiled faintly. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Clara. It's standing anyway." Outside, the spring wind swept across the streets, carrying away the dust and whispers alike. For the first time in years, Clara walked with her head high. Her scars were still there, but now they were marks of survival, not shame. And in the warmth of Ella's hand, she felt something stronger than fear: freedom. The days that followed the hearing passed in a soft, golden haze of relief. For the first time in years, Clara Turner woke without fear clutching at her chest. The nightmares came less often, the trembling eased. The weight that had sat upon her shoulders since the night of the fire seemed lighter, as if the truth she'd spoken in that crowded courthouse had burned away some of her pain. Back at Silver Creek Ranch, spring had come in earnest. The fields rippled with new grass, calves bawled for their mothers, and the sound of the creek running full again filled the air. Clara threw herself into work, tending the garden that Eli had helped her fence off near the kitchen door. Her hands were rough and calloused now, but stronger for it. The earth was teaching her patience and peace. Eli noticed the change in her long before she did. He would watch from the barn doorway as she knelt among the flowers, sunlight catching the pale edges of her hair. She moved with quiet grace, still cautious, but no longer broken. And when she smiled now, it wasn't forced. It was real, soft, and hesitant, like something reborn. One evening, As the sun dipped low behind the mountains, they sat together on the porch. Clara had been darning one of his shirts, and Eli had just finished oiling his saddle. The silence between them was easy now, filled with the small, unspoken comfort of two people who had learned each other's rhythms. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above the rustle of wind through the pines. "Leaving?" he echoed, looking out at the land stretching endless before them. "This place?" She nodded. "You could have started fresh anywhere after your wife passed. Yet you stayed." He thought for a moment before answering. "I reckon I didn't want to outrun my memories. Thought if I worked hard enough, they'd settle down into the land same as me." Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why I came here. To stop running, too." Eli turned to her then, studying her face. The last light of sunset brushed her scars, and he found himself struck not by what they were, but by the strength behind them. "Seems to me you've done more than that, Clara. You've built something new out of the ashes." Her breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't speak. "I never thought anyone could see me that way again." "I see you," he said quietly. "All of you." The words hung between them, tender and raw. She looked away, blinking fast, her fingers twisting in the fabric of his shirt. "You don't have to say that, Eli." He reached out, slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wished. When she didn't, his rough hand covered hers, warm and steady. "I don't say things I don't mean." Something inside her broke open then, not in pain, but in release. For years she had carried shame like a chain around her heart. But in Eli's eyes she saw none of that. He looked at her as if she were not a woman ruined, but one remade. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his. "You've given me more kindness than I ever thought I'd deserve." He smiled, a small, lopsided thing that softened the lines of his face. "Kindness has got nothing to do with it." The sky darkened to a deep violet, stars pricking the horizon one by one. For a long time they sat that way, hand in hand, the world hushed around them. Then, softly, Clara whispered, "Eli, are you afraid to love again?" He was quiet for a long while. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I was. Thought I'd buried that part of myself for good. But when I see you smile, it feels like maybe I was wrong." Her eyes glistened. She leaned in, hesitant, heart trembling, and when he met her halfway, the kiss they shared was gentle, unsure, but real. A promise, not a possession. When they parted, the night air felt different, full of life, full of possibility. For Clara, it wasn't the kind of love she'd once dreamed of. It was better, slower, steadier, born of scars and silence, of two broken souls finding wholeness in each other. And as the first stars shimmered overhead, she realized that love didn't erase pain. It simply made it bearable and beautiful again. By the time spring had fully claimed Silver Creek Ranch, the land itself seemed to mirror the transformation in Clara Turner's life. Snow trickled down from the distant hills, filling the creek with sparkling water that gurgled and ran over the stones. Grass pushed its first bright green shoots through the thawing soil, and buds appeared on the trees, promising flowers yet to come. The ranch, once silent and somber, hummed with activity and life. And Clara felt as if she too was part of that awakening. Every morning, she rose before the sun, tending to the chickens, feeding the calves and gathering eggs. She worked alongside Eli in the fields, learning the rhythms of the ranch, when to water, when to mend fences, when to prepare the soil for planting. Tasks that once would have felt monotonous now carried a quiet satisfaction. She found herself smiling more often, laughter slipping through unexpectedly, a sound she hadn't realized she had missed until it returned. The little garden she had fenced near the kitchen door became her sanctuary. She planted seeds she had brought with her, wild flowers, herbs, and vegetables, careful to give each its place in the earth. Her fingers dug into the soil with reverent patience, pressing seeds gently into the dark earth and whispering small hopes for their growth. Watching the shoots break the surface, she felt a kinship with the land. Just as the seeds needed tending to flourish, so did she. Every green sprout was a reminder that life, even after suffering, could begin anew. Eli watched her often, standing at a distance in the late afternoon sun, hands resting on the rail of the porch. He saw her move with a quiet confidence, no longer flinching at sudden noises or shadows. Her scars, once a source of insecurity and fear, were now part of her story, a story he had come to honor, not hide. He admired how she had taken this harsh, wide land, so foreign and lonely, and made it hers with patience, courage, and care. Together they rebuilt more than just the ranch. They rebuilt a life. They repaired fences, patched the barn roof, and mended tools. Eli taught Clara to ride the horses, showing her how to coax them gently and read their movements, while she helped train a young foal, patient and unafraid. Each small success, the first calf of the season, a fence repaired before a storm, the garden producing its first shoots, was celebrated quietly but with joy. These victories, no matter how minor, stitched their lives together with hope. Evenings were their time to pause. They sat on the porch, sharing meals and stories, watching the sun paint the hills in orange and purple hues. Sometimes they worked side by side, other times simply enjoying the silence of the open plains, the creek's song in the background. The world outside the ranch might have been harsh and demanding, but here, together they had carved a place of safety, love, and belonging. Clara planted a small corner of wildflowers near the barn, an homage to the life she had lost and the life she was reclaiming. She pressed seeds into the earth and whispered prayers, not for protection or escape, but for growth, for renewal. She realized that just as the seasons could transform the land, she too could transform her life. The scars she bore were reminders of survival, not shame. Reminders that she had endured and was still capable of love, courage, and joy. One late afternoon, Eli built a simple wooden swing for her on the porch, suspending it from a sturdy beam. Clara hesitated before sitting on it, feeling the gentle sway of the wood, but as Eli's hand steadied her, a laugh escaped her lips. It was light, unburdened, and entirely new. In that moment, she understood what spring truly meant, not just warmth, not just growth, but rebirth of land, of heart, and of hope. For the first time since she arrived at Silver Creek Ranch, Clara could imagine a future. She could imagine a life filled with love, laughter, and purpose. And she knew that, alongside Eli, she had finally found a place to call home. The summer nights at Silver Creek Ranch were gentle and expansive, the sky stretching endlessly above the valley, stars scattered like diamonds across the deep indigo canvas. For Clara Turner, these nights had become a ritual of reflection. Sitting on the porch swing Eli had built for her, she traced constellations with her fingers and thought about how far she had come. Once her world had been reduced to fear, shame, and the memory of a man who had tried to destroy her. Now the air smelled of wildflowers and sun-warmed earth, and the only hands she clutched were those of a man who loved her wholly. Scars and all that, it was hard for Clara to believe how much life had changed. The journey from St. Louis to Montana had been more than physical. It had been a migration of the spirit. On the train west, she had carried a bundle of belongings and a fragile hope. That hope had grown roots at Silver Creek, nourished by Eli's steady kindness and the rhythm of the land. Every chore she undertook, every flower she planted, every calf she helped deliver was a testament to resilience, a quiet declaration that she was no longer a victim, but a survivor. Her scars, once symbols of shame, had transformed in her eyes. They were not imperfections, but reminders of endurance. She could trace the uneven ridges on her cheek and remember the fire that had taken so much from her. But she could also remember the courage that had brought her here, to this place, to this life. She had survived abuse, loss, and fear, and she had not only survived, but flourished. Clara often thought of her younger sister, who had remained in St. Louis. One evening, by candlelight, she began to write a letter. Dear Mary, I have found a place where I am safe, where the earth gives back what you nurture, and where people can see a soul, not just a face. Life has not been easy. It never is, but it can be good again. I have a home, a companion, and hope that I never believed I would feel. She paused, letting the words sink in. Writing to Mary was both an acknowledgment of the past and a bridge to the future. She would not forget what had been done to her, but she would also not be defined by it. In that way, she had turned her scars into stars, markers of a night survived, guiding her forward into the life she was building. Eli appeared on the porch quietly, carrying 2 mugs of warm milk. He set one beside her and sat down, draping an arm across the back of the swing. Thinking again? He asked softly. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. About everything. About how far I've come and how I didn't think I'd ever get here. You made it, Eli said simply. Not just here, but here, with me. Her heart swelled at the simplicity of his words. He didn't romanticize her past or pity her scars. He saw her as she was, brave, tender, strong. And he loved her anyway. More than that, he trusted her, valued her, and had chosen her every day since the moment she stepped off the train. As the stars emerged overhead, Clara felt an unshakable peace. She reached out for Eli's hand, intertwining fingers, feeling the rough warmth of his skin against hers. The land, the house, the animals, the people, they were all part of her new life, but so was this quiet, intimate connection, which spoke louder than words. She no longer feared judgment nor the return of old ghosts. She knew that whatever came, she had a home and a partner who would face it with her. The night stretched on, infinite and patient. Clara lifted her eyes to the constellations and whispered a quiet promise to herself, to live fully, to nurture hope, and to embrace love without fear. The scars she bore were not weaknesses but stars, luminous markers of survival, guiding her onward, and for the first time she could say without doubt that she belonged. She had found not just safety, but a home, a companion, and a future, a life that held the promise of joy, resilience, and love. In the quiet Montana night, Clara understood that she had become more than the sum of her wounds. She had become whole,